because you were opposed to this war from the start.
Well, I just follow. There's been a UN report on the unemployment, who's got electricity, all that is still 70% unemployment, still enormous cuts in electricity, you know, not proper sanitation and so on. And the killing is going up. I mean, that's a measurable objective fact. I don't want it to be like this, but it's getting worse, not better.
Walter Slocum, I want to give you a chance to respond to something we heard in the report about Paul Bremer. He divided Shias and Sunnis by giving each sect a separate quota of seats in the governing council. It's not the first time the finger's been pointed at him.
Well, Paul Bremer didn't invent the differences between Shia and Sunnis.
But he exacerbated them.
No, I don't think so. I was there during the time that the governing council was being set up, and believe me, the pressures to make sure that there was a balance of the different groups didn't come from CPA, it came from the Iraqis. The film is an interesting presentation. It's got some fascinating bits to it, but one of its most misleading impressions is the idea that Muqtada al-Sadr speaks for the Shia community generally. He certainly speaks for some Shia, but it's Ayatollah Sistani who is the leading figure for the Shia community in general, and his views are very different.
And do you buy into what Muqtada al-Sadr was saying, talking of accommodations and a truce?
Well, I hope it's right. The challenge now, whether you think the war was a good idea or a bad idea, the challenge now for both people from outside, and most important for Iraqis, is to find some kind of national reconciliation among all these different groups who all blame each other and blame us and blame foreigners and a lot of things. And if Muqtada al-Sadr will stand up to that responsibility without compromising his basic views on what Iraq ought to be in the future, that's a very constructive development. Since last November, or whenever it was, he has been largely taking a position that he'll continue to say what he believes, but his army, his militia has been relatively quiet, and that's a very good thing if those are his instructions.
All right, Dr. Al-Sheikli, do you believe Muqtada al-Sadr?
Well, Muqtada, in fact, had changed his mind over the past 2 years. And what I hear in this film is something quite different, and I think is welcome. Indeed, one should not go against the coalition because they have a very restricted mandate. By United Nations resolution, they're going to have to leave whenever the Iraqi government does ask them, and the first extension expires at the end of 2005. The other thing is, out of 18 provinces, 14 going to be handed to the Iraqi forces. So Muqtada al-Sadr really does not represent even the Shiite cleric. And one thing I think is very important, both Muqtada and the Sunni cleric had insisted that they all trying to bridge this gap. The idea of Shia-Sunni separatism, it was alien to the Iraqis prior to March 2003.
Claire Short, when should British and American troops get out? When is the first practical time in your view?
My view is that if they declared they have no wishes for long-term presence and that they were willing, because the Americans do want long-term presence and are building long-term bases, and they do want to have a client state in Iraq. If they said, we have no wish to stay, let's negotiate an end to the occupation, I think you could bring most of the forces in the country to want to support their own government and get an orderly exit. But the Americans won't do that. They want to stay in Iraq long-term. And therefore, I think the insurgency will continue indefinitely.
And Mike Gapes, briefly, the reason you can't give a deadline is because you think it would send the wrong signal. Paint a picture briefly, if you would, of what life would be like if British troops left too soon.
If British troops left and American troops left too soon, then the Iraqis didn't have sufficient police and military forces, then there could be the kind of civil war you've been predicting. I think they have to stay as long as the Iraqi government asks them to stay.
All right. From all of you for taking part in this part of our discussion, thank you very much.
Tonight on NewsNight Scotland, shocking new statistics show the size of the west of Scotland's knife problem. Is there anything we can do to end it? Plus, the minister responsible says he's unhappy with the way the Met Office has handled the proposed closure of its centre in Aberdeen. I'll be asking campaigners whether that's good enough. And second place, but he's the country's latest sporting hero, or how Scotland learned to love Colin Montgomery. Good evening. The latest statistics on knife crime from Strathclyde Police make familiar, if depressing, reading. The number of murders involving a blade in the Glasgow area is 3.5 times higher than anywhere else in the UK, with levels of knife violence now on a par with the most dangerous cities in Eastern Europe. The figures add up to give the city the sort of reputation it's tried time and again to ditch. But despite the best efforts of government, the public, agencies and the police, the problem remains stubbornly persistent. Glenn Cooksley reports.
Back in 1968, singer Frankie Vaughan tried to help rid Easterhouse of its weapons. Nearly 40 years later, the west of Scotland still has an appalling problem. Knives are openly on sale and routinely carried by some young men. Police say that of the 30 murders in the west of Scotland this year, 13 involved the use of a knife. And statistics show that a blade was involved in 85 attempted murders. On average, nearly 25 serious knife assaults have taken place every week for the last 6 months.
It's something that's been with us since the Razor gangs when Percy Sillitoe was the Chief Constable in Glasgow. What we've realised is we haven't actually made any appreciable and sustained difference to that propensity for violence that these young men seem to have.
Studies carried out in Glasgow hospitals found the number of knife attacks could be 70% higher than reported figures, as many victims are reluctant to go to the police.
In Australia, where I worked for a number of years, I saw a very low level of violence and specifically a low level of weapon usage. That was direct contrast to Cape Town, where there's a high percentage of gun used in violent crime. Glasgow, having moved here and worked here for a number of years, it is apparent that knives are very commonly used in assaults, and it's a real culture of violence using knives.
Last November, First Minister Jack McConnell announced plans to tackle antisocial behaviour, including knife crime. The proposed police bill would raise the age limit on the sale of knives from 16 to 18 and boost the maximum penalty for carrying a blade from 2 to 4 years. Last month, ministers also began consulting on plans to ban the sale of swords and introduce a licensing scheme for the sale of non-domestic knives.
I'm joined now by John Paul Fitzpatrick, a senior youth worker with the Breakthrough Project in Glasgow's Maryhill district. John Paul Fitzpatrick, you work with some of these youngsters who carry blades. I mean, do you have a theory as to why it should be a particular problem in Glasgow?
Not really. I think that we have a problem in the United Kingdom in every major city. I don't think Glasgow's any exception. The statistics are shocking and make for very depressing reading. However, we do need to bear in mind it is a minority of young people that are perpetrating these crimes. I really think we've got to look at the underlying causes in terms of the backgrounds of the young people. I think some work has been done in terms of profiling the types of young people that are engaged in this type of crime, traditionally from low educational attainment, poor backgrounds, and the kind of range of factors, like alcohol, drugs, that contribute to young people feeling threatened in their communities and getting caught up in territorial and gang violence and unfortunately, occasionally ending...
But these youngsters you work with, I mean, some of them presumably would carry blades just as a matter of course, would they?
Yes, possibly. Some. And again, a very small minority of young people are engaged in this.
But why do they do that?
Well, Gordon, from getting into discussions with them, and usually it's at the other end where it's too late, when they're involved in the criminal justice system, young people kind of cite reasons of feeling vulnerable in their own communities, ironically, and take it as a form of defence. And I think that's the kind of angle that they're coming from. I think also there's a very much a West of Scotland male machismo attitude attached to the carrying of knives, almost in terms of like getting respect from peers. And there's that type of culture which has to be kind of tackled head on to really address that and to break that down. Some of these young people are third generation unemployed, have very low self-esteem, very low confidence, and it's the whole kind of gambit of social issues that these young people are facing. And I think that's what's making them prone to participate in this kind of behaviour.
Is that? I mean, you said low educational attainment a few moments ago.
Sometimes,
yes. Is that a characteristic?
It appears to be from the profiles that the experts have done and from our dialogue with the police that young people have kind of low aspirations, low educational attainment, quite often kind of social work involvement. I'm painting a fairly stereotypical picture, but from an experience of dealing with young people on the streets, that appears to be the pattern.
And I mean, is one fact. I mean, obviously, it's appalling that there should be such an incidence of carrying knives. But I suppose some people would say, well, better than that if they were walking around with submachine guns. I mean, is there a corresponding lack of gun culture amongst these kids in a way that you might see in some other cities?
We're certainly not in contact with young people who are engaged in the kind of the gun culture. However, also it tends to be a phase that young people go through in terms of like a transitory phase. They kind of grow out of this type of behaviour. That's of course if the criminal justice system doesn't intervene. So really, for me, we've got to start educating young people at a younger age, at primary school age. Police, youth workers, community workers, social workers, teaching staff have to work together to tackle this problem head on through education, Gordon, to try and address the culture, to tackle it head on, to create a change and to make a difference to these people's lives. We've also got to tackle the drug issues, the poverty issues. We can't tackle the knife culture in isolation.
All right, John Paul Fitzgerald, thanks very much indeed. Now, there's been a storm brewing for some weeks about the future of the Met Office Weather Centre in Aberdeen. It's one of 6 sites which could be closed under restructuring plans. If that happened, forecasting would move to Exeter with a loss of around 30 jobs. That may not sound like very much, but this isn't an economic story. Since the possibility of closure was first revealed by BBC Scotland last month, there's been an outcry from protesters worried that the loss of local forecasters could have a detrimental effect on safety for the offshore industries. Now it seems the Minister with responsibility for the Met Office shares some of their concerns.
It's not hard to see why the Met Office has a forecasting centre in Aberdeen. The centre opened there in 2001 to provide Britain's offshore oil industry with the most accurate forecast possible. The shipping forecast was moved to the Aberdeen office less than a year ago because it's considered a centre of expertise. The Defence Minister, Don Tuig, has admitted that the closure threat has been badly handled. He's promised a 90-day consultation period. But is that enough to placate the protesters? For them, this controversy echoes the storm which raged over the closure of Scottish Coast Guard stations in the late 1990s.
Don Tuig had promised to join us tonight, but unfortunately a diary change put paid to that. However, before coming on air, I spoke to the Liberal Democrat MP for Gordon, Malcolm Bruce, who's part of the cross-party campaign to save the Aberdeen office. They had just met the Minister, and I began by asking Mr Bruce what Mr Tuig had to say.
Well, the Minister made it absolutely clear that this was a real consultation. It would take as long as necessary. He wanted to make sure he got the right decision, and he was in listening mode. And we had representatives from the Met Office who were explaining their recommendation, but frankly, not very convincingly, I have to say. They admitted that Aberdeen cost annually $2.1 million, but they didn't know what revenue it generated. And to suggest that they should pull out of Aberdeen when the oil price is top $60 seemed rather extraordinary, and they didn't really have an answer to that.
All right, so this is the original idea of a 9-week consultation. That's not going to happen. It's just as long as it takes.
It was a 90-day consultation which the Minister announced. What he's saying is that he will make sure that he hears all the arguments and he will make the decision when he thinks it's ready to be made. He appreciates that this is a crucial change. The Met Office have said their high-tech computer in Exeter should be supporting operations on the ground, to have customer interface and to enable people really to deal with the Met Office as a human organisation. And that to centralise it all in Exeter with a few sales consultants and other operations around the country, which aren't weather forecasting, would be damaging, or certainly would be a fundamental change of policy. We believe it would be damaging. We think the Met Office would lose business. We think that their private competitors would take it, but we also think the public sector who use the Met Office would lose. So it would be damaging all round, and it's not credible for a UK operation such as the Met Office to be able to say to Scotland, we will run the forecasting for your area, 40% of the land area, half the marine area of the country, from a base in Exeter. It's simply not credible marketing.
Well, why isn't it? Because, I mean, I don't know exactly how they do these forecasting, but presumably it's largely by computer, and they've got sensors out there in the North Sea. Now, given the state of technology, it would seem a rather outdated idea that you have to have a little office perched on a cliff overlooking the North Sea in order to do the forecasting there.
Well, I can assure you it's not a little office, it's a high-tech office in a science park in Aberdeen. But I think the point is that, yes, the supercomputers give huge amount of data, and yes, you can provide forecasting for long distances from one connection. But that does not mean there's no human dimension. It does not mean that interpreting that information, providing local data, local interface, presenting it in a way that meets the need of customers is not an essential part of the process. If it weren't, why is it that 3 competitors to the Met Office are operating major services in Aberdeen, employing 30 or 40 people each, all very well poised to take the business away from the Met Office, but leave the public sector users without the kind of support they've had in the past?
Well, presumably because these competitors don't have enormous offices in Exeter.
Well, some of them have computers in other parts of the world and have overheads of their own. But yes, part of the difficulty the Met Office has is a gold standard that makes it somewhat more expensive. But the reality is they set up their operation in Aberdeen 15 years ago. In the last year, they've added to it by transferring the shipping forecast. And up until 3 months ago, they were saying that it was a centre of excellence which had a fantastic interface with its customers and which was providing a valuable service. So how can they suddenly decide that it's no longer required and everything can be done from Exeter? And the danger is you have a centre of excellence here, you will break it up, you will lose business, you will finish up not saving money, and you will lose some of the experience and expertise.
I thought one reason was that they already have lost business. I mean, haven't they just lost quite a big contract with, I think it was the Shell oil company?
Well, that's true. They've lost it to a company in the Netherlands, and of course Shell is a Dutch company. But I think the point is that chicken or egg? If you announce that you're in the process of removing your
but
activity...
hang on. If Shell is quite happy for a place in the Netherlands to do the weather forecasting, it rather undercuts, doesn't it, the idea that North Sea oil operators have to have something in Aberdeen?
Because the technology's in the Netherlands, but the support staff that are servicing Shell in the North Sea are based in Aberdeen, and that's really the point. Of course, this office does not just service the oil industry, but that's their major commercial customer at a time when activity in the North Sea is rocketing up. Is rather an odd moment to be pulling out. But I think the question you have to ask, is the UK Met Office seriously suggesting that it can meet the needs of all the variety of customers across Scotland without having weather forecasters based in Scotland to interpret the computer data from Exeter